get our resume. Or there we go. All right, we've got our recording going there. Hi, everybody. Thanks again for coming to this webinar concerning housing discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Before I jump into introductions, I do want to do a couple of logistics and housekeeping items. I do want to let everybody know captioning is available. For closed captioning, please click the live transcript button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You can then select show subtitle. I've also sent those instructions in the chat as well. My name is Brian McKenzie. I'm Senior Training and Compliance Program Manager at the Equal Rights Center. I'm happy to be with you here today to discuss this important and developing topic. I'd like to do a couple of thank yous though first. So first, thank you to Kenneth Saunders, Director of the Fairfax County Office of Human Rights and Equity Programs. Thanks to Margot Squires and to everybody else on their staff for assisting with this webinar today. For those of you who are not familiar with the agency, Fairfax County Office of Human Rights and Equity Programs receives and investigates complaints alleging violations of the Fairfax County Human Rights Ordinance and related state and federal anti-discrimination laws, including discrimination in housing, which of course we'll be discussing today. From the Equal Rights Center, I'd like to thank our Executive Director, Kate Scott, and Nick Adjami from our team at the ERC for all of their support. The ERC is a civil rights organization that identifies and seeks to eliminate unlawful and unfair discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations in the greater Washington, D.C. area and nationwide as well. So thank you again to everybody involved from both of these organizations. These events are truly a collaborative effort between all of us. So with that, a couple of final logistics. As a reminder, captioning is available in the toolbar. Please do click live transcript button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and click show subtitle. Also, we are going to go today for about 70 to 80 minutes. I do plan to leave time for questions at the end, but if we've met before, you know that I always like to also engage. So if I ask you anything or if you have any questions, please feel free to ask here as we go, and I will monitor everything. Please try to keep it in the chat tool though. That is the only thing I do ask. It is just me here today. So I do ask that you please try to keep it in the chat tool. Also, we have developed a one-pager on the topic, and we'll be sending it out to everybody here in the upcoming days as well. So look for that at the email that you used to register for this course. All right, so now let's jump into cover fair housing and specifically housing discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. I do need to provide, of course, my final disclaimer, which is that I am not an attorney, so nothing you are hearing today should be considered legal advice. This will all be presented in the frame of best practices. So with that, I do want to confirm here, can everybody just see my PowerPoint as I'm going to go off camera so we can focus on the materials here? If you can you please raise your hand? You should be able to hear me and see the PowerPoint now at this. All right, I see everybody raising their hand. That's awesome. Okay. Thank you all very much. I appreciate that. So then let's jump into our content for today. We'll start with just a quick overview of fair housing in general to make sure we're all on the same page and also to figure out why these developments have taken place that we're going to cover today as well. So we can start by defining fair housing as the sale or the rental of housing free from discriminatory practices or policies while continuing to treat everyone equally and with respect. So what are some reasons that fair housing, I hope, is important to everybody here today? Why are you attending this webinar? Could you throw that into the chat if you have any thoughts there? And I'll read some responses. Why is fair housing so important? I can think of a few different reasons right off the bat here. First, let's see. I'm just going to read some responses. I hope people don't mind. I do like to always reward people for participating here. So if I do mispronounce your name, I apologize. Please forgive me. You see here, Benjamin. Yeah, I agree with Benjamin. Hey, it's the law. Absolutely. Trudy mentions equal access. Yeah, it's important to provide equal access. Everybody should get a fair shake. I see that comment. Absolutely. Yeah, Beth says housing should be a universal right for all. Absolutely. So yeah, fair housing is important, and some people are here because of their job. Yeah, so fair housing is absolutely the right thing to do, folks. It is civil rights law, and we always like to argue too that it is smart business practice. In today's day and age, if folks have a discriminatory policy or practice, guess what? Word is going to get out, whether it is social media, Google reviews, whatever. People are going to find out about that policy. So yeah, fair housing is the right thing to do, the law, and it is of course a smart business practice. The Fair Housing Act was signed into law. We're coming up here on 54 years in just a couple of months, on April 11th, 1968. Since then, we've changed the Fair Housing Act in 1988 to add a couple of additional protected classes. But the Fair Housing Act was signed into law again on that date, April 11th, 1968, exactly 1 week after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee, both as a tribute to the legacy of Dr. King and open housing, but also as a sorry, I was reading a comment there. Also as a reaction to protests and to demonstrations that were going on across the country in the immediate aftermath of the assassination. So the Fair Housing Act, again, we are approaching Fair Housing Month here in just a couple of weeks. So keep an eye out, of course, for events from all of our various agencies, I'm sure, as well, coming down. So the Fair Housing Act is made up of 3 big parts. And I do think all of these parts of the FHA are equally useful. So I really like the image of a wheel there, because you do need all 3 parts of the Fair Housing Act to keep it rolling forward. Of course, protected classes, prohibited activities, and accessibility requirements. Now, today, we're not going to focus so much on accessibility or disability, but we're really going to be focused around protected classes and some prohibited activities. But again, all 3 parts, though, are really equally important. So what's covered under the Fair Housing Act? You see there, any building, structure, or portion designed or intended for occupancy is going to be covered. Well, what does that mean exactly? That means apartments, condominiums, emergency shelters, transitional housing, single-family housing, college dorm rooms, mobile home parks, nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and then even vacant land designated for residential construction may be covered under the Fair Housing Act. Could anybody throw it in the chat here quick? Why would vacant land ever be designated for residential construction? I get this question a lot at all of my trainings. Vacant land. There's no house there. How's that covered by the Fair Housing Act? Hey, yeah, if you could be building a house there, you would be preventing somebody from living there. So if you're preventing somebody from purchasing that plot of land because of their protected class status, you are ultimately preventing them from potentially living at that property. So you see there, the Fair Housing Act really applies to a wide variety of different living situations. Yeah, I see. I just want to give Jasmine with some good answers there. Lucy as well. Absolutely. There are exemptions to the Fair Housing Act. Now, I am not going to go super in depth here. I know we are Virginia focused, and I do have some Virginia exemptions coming up here later on. I do default to, hey, you need to know your local law here. So these are just general. We are going to provide and discuss some Virginia exemptions in just a minute, though. So in general, you might see housing for older persons, 55 and up. HOPA property, they're going to be exempt from the Fair Housing Act on the basis of family status. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Religious organizations, they're just going to be exempt on the basis of religion. And then you do have small landlord exemptions as well. Again, default there, you need to know your local law. That changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Of course, there are a couple caveats. unless you hire that real estate agent or a management company, or unless you make a discriminatory statement, which does include advertising. I always recommend, if you're especially a small landlord, please make sure your advertising is in check. So the Fair Housing Act really applies to a wide variety of different people in a wide variety of different living situations. And again, I know there are some specifics with Virginia that we'll talk about in just a minute here. All right, so let's now start to move into a kind of a conversation about protected classes. And you'll see where we're going with this, and this is going to ultimately lead us to discussing discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So protected classes can be defined as a group of people who share a common trait, a common characteristic, and are then legally protected from discrimination on the basis of a trait or a characteristic. There are 7 federal protections. Hopefully we can all get these quickly here in the chat. A federal protection refers to every place in the country, by the way. So whether, I know everybody's here probably from Virginia today, but if you happen to be joining me from Alaska, these 7 protected classes will still apply. Could anybody throw anything into the chat here? What are some examples of protected classes? Yeah, Vincent in the chat, race, disability. We can get all 7 of these. We got a big crowd here today. Race, disability. We'll talk more about age discrimination later on. We won't be saying that's a federal one. Yeah, family status, absolutely. Religion. National origin, absolutely. So the only thing I think I haven't seen come up here, I think you guys did okay. I'm kidding. We have race, color, national origin, religion, sex, family status, and disability. So again, these are the federal protections: race, color, national origin, religion, sex, family status, and disability. These are under the Fair Housing Act. Hey, I do see a few folks here commenting in the Q&A. I do want to encourage you. I do see it there. Please try to move that into the chat if at all possible. So again, we're kind of moving quickly here through all these because we're experts, but a few bits of context here are important. Color is going to be a protected class because you can't always assume somebody's race or national origin simply by their skin color. So from a fair housing perspective, you could have people who share a common race, a common national origin, and then they could be treated differently when looking for housing. And it wouldn't be because of their race or their national origin. It would be because of their skin color. National origin, you can think about where you, your family are from. Religion, just as a best practice here, remember, there is no list of formalized approved religions. And this also includes the lack of religion as well. Sex discrimination includes now a couple of different things as of 2021. I'm just going to make a note here that obviously sex discrimination, treating somebody differently because of their sex or gender, but this also now includes claims of discrimination based off of sexual orientation and gender identity, which we'll be talking about kind of in depth here in just a few minutes. Family status, of course, refers to families with children under the age of 18. So saying no kids allowed, for instance, in an advertisement. And then we have disability. So reasonable accommodations, reasonable modifications, that sort of thing. Assistance animals, everybody always loves assistance animals, talking about assistance animals. All of that's going to fall under disability. So these are our big 7 federal protections, again, under the Fair Housing Act. Of course, local areas also do add their own additional protections. And I do want to provide a quick overview here, especially of Northern Virginia, of our local protections. As a reminder, it is up to every individual to make sure you know what is protected in your local area if you are a housing provider. This can get pretty complicated if you're going from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, so make sure you know what is protected in each specific local area. or if you own properties in Virginia, Maryland, or DC, that can get pretty complicated. So we'll just focus on Virginia. And I love my little Shenandoah shield there. I can't wait to go back here this spring. But let's do a quick overview here of some Virginia protections. So statewide in Virginia, elderliness has been protected since before I moved to the area. And elderliness in Virginia, and apologies, this is not myself. I am just here teaching this class. Elderliness is considered 55 and up in Virginia. And then as of last year, we've expanded our protected classes, or recently, I'll just say recently, we've expanded protected classes here in Virginia to include sexual orientation, gender identity, military status, and source of funds. I'll provide some more context on those in just a second here. Arlington County, marital status and sexual orientation. Falls Church, we have marital status. Alexandria City, sexual orientation. I do not have gender identity up there. My apologies, that should be up there. Ancestry, marital status and age. Fairfax County, marital status. And Prince William County, we have age or marital status. So that's just a quick overview of the Northern Virginia, the common protections here in Northern Virginia. So I do want to provide some context here now to those local statewide protections. As a reminder, Virginia exemptions apply to small landlords. So a landlord who owns 3 or fewer single family homes. We also do have a Mrs. Murphy's exemption in Virginia, which applies to owner or landlords who live in 1 or more of a unit with 4 or fewer rental units there. So you have that multifamily building with 4 or fewer units. That's called that Mrs. Murphy's exemption. And we also have exemptions for source of funds. So the source of funds or source of income exemptions apply to all housing providers who own more than 4 rental dwelling units and more than a 10% interest in more than 4 rental dwelling units in Virginia. So again, the source of funds, source of income protections, they apply to all housing providers who own more than 4 rental dwelling units or over a 10% interest in more than 4 rental dwelling units in Virginia. So source of funds, again, I just want to provide a really quick overview here of our local protections. Source of funds is going to refer to any source that lawfully provides funds to or on behalf of a renter or a buyer, including any assistance, benefit, or subsidy program that's administered by a governmental or a non-governmental entity. There is a 15-day limit for source of funds to be approved. I would just say here, please do not delay or purposefully delay that approval process. If there is a delay, I would encourage you, especially if you're here as a housing provider, to document the purpose of that delay. Obviously, this includes housing choice vouchers. That's probably the big one here today, commonly known as the Section 8 program, disability benefits, veterans benefits, and alimony. I would really just say any legal form of income is the best practice to remember there. As a reminder, think about language, no Section 8. Make sure you're not changing terms and conditions, so offering different incentives, different credit scores, different background checks. Make sure you're applying those standards equally. And remember that minimum income requirements should be based on an applicant's portion of the rent. So again, feel free, if you have a question about this, we'll talk about that maybe at the end and hold that for questions, but feel free to submit it. And we do need to kind of move through that though. I do know that's a big hot topic here for everybody though today in Virginia. Military status, our other new protection, prohibits discrimination against veterans or active service members who were discharged or released under conditions other than dishonorable. Some examples could be a real estate agent steering or persuading a veteran to buy a home in a specific neighborhood, or a property manager allowing stereotypes about veterans to influence their housing decision. So another recent protection here. All right, then we have our prohibited activities. And I want you to think about these prohibited activities in terms of discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So let's start to brainstorm what some examples here could possibly be. How could these prohibited activities apply to those protected classes? So you have the refusal to sell or the refusal to rent. I do not want to rent to this person because of their protected class status. Discriminatory terms or discriminatory conditions. Changing a term or condition of somebody's rental because of their protected class status. So what would be a term and condition? What do I mean by that? What might a term or condition of rental be? Anybody want to throw that into the chat? Yeah, so Benjamin says changing the amount of a down payment on a purchase, requiring a higher security deposit, as Amy mentions. Absolutely. So you're changing the term and condition, you're requiring somebody to use a longer lease. Absolutely. Changing the term and condition of somebody's rental because of their protected class status. Or perhaps it's advertising. I think this is going to be a fun one to talk about later on in this presentation. So advertising a preference or advertising a preference for a particular protected class. My rule of thumb here is to always focus on the property and never focus on the person that you want to rent to, right? There are too many different protected classes. It's really going to be too challenging. Focus on describing your property and never the person. You know, some different examples of advertisements we might see would be advertising for a particular sex or gender in a non-shared living space, a non-roommates type of living situation, advertising that preference. Advertising no children allowed. That's a common one as well. And of course, you do see perhaps also something along the lines of, yeah, and we do have a question here in the chat. I do want to handle this one right here because I can kind of get to this one. What about somebody who references square footage and says best for single? Well, for that one, I think you're probably going to run into potentially issues based on family status or marital status, depending on your local area. You do need to know your local occupancy codes here, but it would be pretty hard to ever say perfect for single in an advertisement because almost all places can have two people in a shared living situation. Good question, though. So be careful with your advertising. Again, I think that falls into, you know, never define the person and not, I'm sorry, always, sorry, that would focus on always describing the person and never the property. Good question. Misrepresenting availability. Hey, tell folks what's available. Let them make their own choices. You shouldn't be lying or misrepresenting availability to somebody because of their sexual orientation or because of their disability. We have seen that with disability. Blockbusting or steering. Blockbusting, I'm not going to go in depth there today. I would just say blockbusting, you're thinking of an older civil rights era term around panic sales, neighborhood values, white flight. And then we have steering. Steering is always familiar with the Fair Housing Act. Who could define steering for me in the chat there? Yeah, directing renters, buyers to shared or certain neighborhoods because of their protected class status. Absolutely. Could also be directing people to a particular building because of their family status. We've seen that one with children, directing all families with children to live on the first floor of a unit. Yeah, absolutely. So you're leading somebody to a particular area because of their protected class status. And then I think these last two bullet points are going to be really useful to keep in mind here in just a couple of minutes. Harassment, threats, intimidation, or coercion, and retaliation as well, especially with regards to, we think again about sexual harassment. We think again about retaliation, or harassment due to somebody's sexual orientation, somebody's gender identity. And we'll talk exclusively about those things here in just a second. So these are our prohibited activities under the Fair Housing Act. Again, remember, you need to have a prohibited activity occurring because of somebody's protected class status. So hopefully, as we went through these prohibited activities, you tried to put these into the context of, again, discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So sex discrimination in general can be defined as the denial of an opportunity to rent or purchase a home because of your sex or gender. An example, increasing rent or threatening an eviction, applying different rules because of your sex or gender, advertising a preference in a non-roommate's living situation. So I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of that here. That is extremely complicated. I would just say if you are renting a private apartment building, a private single family home, there is absolutely no need to ever use somebody's sex or gender in an advertisement. If it is a shared living space, it does get complicated, kind of that roommates style living situation. And then also sexual harassment or discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So you see that sex discrimination really encompasses quite a bit here. And we've had, again, these updates here recently. So let's start by looking at sexual harassment and fair housing. Sexual harassment can be defined as any unwanted sexual advance, a request for sexual favors, or other unwelcome verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. This includes several different things. Sexual harassment can occur to any person, male or female, can be committed by somebody of the same sex, the same gender, or by somebody of the opposite sex or gender. As a reminder that harassment by a housing provider is a violation of the Fair Housing Act, and housing providers have an obligation to prevent harassment if it is reported to them. Sexual harassment takes many forms. The first is what we call quid pro quo sexual harassment. Quid pro quo harassment occurs when a housing provider requires a person to submit to or engage in sexual conduct as a condition of obtaining or maintaining housing or housing-related services. So some common examples of quid pro quo sexual harassment might be a landlord who texts an applicant that he will not rent her an apartment unless she has sex with him, or a maintenance technician who refuses to make repairs without sexual favors from a resident. So again, quid pro quo sexual harassment is kind of that, sure, we would love to rent to you if that, we can do that if this happens. That type of language, it's an exchange. Hostile environment harassment. This occurs when a housing provider subjects a person to unwelcome sexual conduct that interferes with the sale, rental, availability, or terms of housing. And this includes financing as well. A lot of times people get stuck on rental cases when it comes to fair housing. But remember, this applies to many different aspects and all different parts of a housing transaction. Some examples of hostile environment harassment could be a landlord who subjects a tenant to unwelcome touching, kissing, or groping, or a property manager who might make unwelcome sexual comments, a property manager who makes unwelcome sexual comments about a tenant's body. And then we have retaliation under this umbrella as well. Retaliation includes eviction, rent increases, refusing repairs, or restricting the use of facilities or services, or threats or intimidation as well. You can see here that retaliation oftentimes overlaps with quid pro quo sexual harassment. If a tenant or a resident perhaps refuses somebody's advances in exchange for services, oftentimes they are subject to retaliation. So you need to keep in mind that we don't want to put all of these different things into just general buckets either. There is overlap, and really kind of the category, doesn't matter so much again. But all of these things can be present. I do want to take a second and pause here. Does anybody have any questions around sexual harassment at this point under the Fair Housing Act or sex discrimination? And thank you for the kind words in the chat there. All right. So in 2021, it was announced now that sex discrimination includes at the federal level under the Fair Housing Act, as I already referenced, discrimination based off of sexual orientation and gender identity. So HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, will now accept and investigate claims based on these protections. In addition, as a reminder, sexual orientation and gender identity are now protected in Virginia as well. So now protected in Virginia as well. So it's been a really big couple of years here in terms of developments with regards to these protected classes. I do think it's useful to start with a series of definitions here. So discrimination based on sexual orientation is discriminating against a person for their actual or their perceived sexual orientation. This includes discrimination due to somebody's appearance, their mannerisms, their partner, or any self-identifying symbols. For example, flags, stickers, etc. Probably the most common example of discrimination, perhaps here, could be a landlord who refuses to rent to a same-gender couple. Gender identity and discrimination against gender identity refers to discriminating against somebody for their gender-related identity, appearance, or other gender-related characteristic of an individual, with or without regard to the individual's designated sex at birth. Some examples here could be harassing a tenant by not using correct names or by not using chosen names on purpose. So again, you're purposefully harassing a tenant by not using their correct pronouns or their chosen name on purpose, or a landlord who charges different fees or conditions after a tenant transitions. So gender identity and sexual orientation, again, now included as an example of sex discrimination under the Fair Housing Act, and also incorporated as part of Virginia's protected classes as well. As a reminder here, gender identity and gender expression can sometimes or are sometimes used, not appropriately, interchangeably. As a reminder, these are different definitions as well. Gender identity can be thought of as a gender that a person identifies as, whereas gender expression is the appearance and behavior presented by that person. So they are different. I think there are other few definitions here that we can cover to hopefully all provide us on some equal ground. For example, LGBTQ+ is an acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. And the plus sign is used to recognize limitless sexual orientation or gender identities used. Sex assigned at birth can be defined as the sex, male, female, or intersex that a doctor or midwife might use to describe a child at birth based on external anatomy. Transgender refers to an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and/or expression is different from cultural expectations based on the sex that they were assigned at birth. As a note here, being transgender does not imply sexual orientation. Cisgender refers to a term used to describe a person whose gender identity aligns with those typically associated with the sex assigned to them at birth. Non-binary is an adjective describing a person who does not identify exclusively as a man or a woman. Non-binary people may identify as being both a man and a woman, somewhere in between, or as falling completely outside these categories. While many also identify as transgender, please note that not all non-binary people do. Bisexual refers to a person emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to more than one sex, gender, or gender identity, though not necessarily simultaneously or in the same way. This word is sometimes used interchangeably with pansexual. So I think those are just some useful definitions here that kind of put us all on the same page, hopefully, and introduce us to some of these concepts. So why is this important? Well, studies have shown recently that 22% of LGBTQ+ individuals have experienced discrimination in housing. Specifically, this number drastically increases when we think about transgender individuals to 36%. So that's a huge number of people. We've done studies at the ERC over the years, and testing has revealed transgender testers were told about fewer available units and less likely to be offered housing opportunities. For those of you who are unfamiliar with what testing might mean, testing is ultimately a simulated housing transaction where you send out two people of opposite protected class status, and we observe how they are treated. Are they shown the same units? Are they offered the same rent rates? Are they generally treated in a similar manner? And as you see here, again, numerous studies that we've done at the ERC have found a difference when it comes to gender identity and sexual orientation. So again, fewer units available, less likely to be offered housing opportunities. And this is of course important, especially locally, because you see here in the DC metro area, that the DC area has the 7th highest LGBTQ+ population in the entire country. So these are really important protections for our local area. So what are some challenges that are encountered? Well, the fear of being discriminated against or stereotyped. Having to misrepresent who you are. I'll talk more about that one in just a second. Experiencing social isolation. Being targeted with harassment or violence. Remember, we talked about harassment a few minutes ago. So hostile environment harassment or retaliation. Or encountering different rules or different terms or conditions of rental. We talked about that one as a prohibited activity under the Fair Housing Act. I do want to provide a few reminders here with regards to IDs and identification. Please remember, recent studies have indicated 21% of transgender individuals have been, only 21% of transgender people have been able to update their IDs. This leads to several severe collateral consequences. A collateral consequence is something that happens because of something else. It's happening because of your protected class status in this case. So a collateral consequence includes denial of housing or employment opportunities. And again, being harassed or experiencing violence because your face doesn't match your ID. Many local areas have taken steps to address this. So I do think it's important as potentially a housing provider to be aware of these updates. For example, Maryland and DC, I believe both allow X on IDs. whereas Virginia, as of 2020, implemented non-binary on their driver's licenses. And of course, please, as a general best practice, really remember that it can be difficult to update these IDs, and this is not necessarily an easy process for everybody. Also, when it comes to pronouns, best practices here, please always respect preferred pronouns as much as possible. Common examples, everybody's seen probably in your emails, the pronouns now, he, him, she, her, or perhaps gender neutral pronouns like they, them, or ze, here. Please remember, this is not an exhaustive list, and it's always okay to ask as well. Another update that's been kind of a roller coaster over the last few years is what's known as the HUD Equal Access Rule. This has gone back and forth through various administrations, and we won't get into that at all, but HUD-funded housing must generally be made available without regard to actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. There is, well, when this equal access rule was passed, there was an exception for single-sex emergency shelters with shared sleeping areas or bathrooms. However, there is no longer that exception, which means that people should receive services at a facility that matches their gender identity. Please do not isolate or segregate people based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Another important word to remember is the word ally. And you can think of being an ally as anybody who supports equality and fairness for LGBTQ+ individuals and their family. So what are some best practices that we could all use to become better allies? Please always respect preferred names and preferred pronouns. Please don't make assumptions about somebody's sexual orientation, gender identity, or really, you know what? How about any protected class status? Remember that language and terminology are fluid. They change over time. So, you know, it's okay to mess up, but don't be afraid to ask. If you make a mistake, it happens. But the important thing is to correct your mistakes and try to stay up to date. Please try to use inclusive language on forms or with policies or procedures. I think this is a really good one, especially for the housing providers on the line here. If you got forms, make sure, again, please try to use inclusive language on your forms. And also, I do want to emphasize the importance of continuing education here as well. It's important to remember, again, language, terminology changes over time. So, hey, it's important to stay up to date on these rules, especially in these policies and these best practices. You see here, we've seen, again, we've covered several significant updates at both the federal and the local level. I have a few questions here around, well, I'm gonna save those for now. I do see questions coming in. Folks, please do try to submit them here. That is perfectly fine. I do see a few here that I'm just gonna save for the end of our time here, okay? So I do see folks coming in here with a few questions. And I do wanna encourage you to continue to submit them. So again, just remember these best practices. Of course, there are other best practices out there as well, but we do wanna encourage you. I mean, again, I do wanna emphasize, you know, don't be afraid to ask, and the importance of staying up to date and remembering and respecting preferred names and pronouns and never making assumptions. So let's do some practice scenarios here. All right, so in our first scenario of the day, we have an applicant at a leasing office who is shown an ID as required by the housing provider. Let's see what happens. All right, so based off of the content we covered today, what mistakes did this leasing agent make? And what are some best practices or a possible correction for this behavior here in the chat? Throw that into the chat. Let's brainstorm some of these here. So based off, again, the content we covered today, what mistakes did the leasing agent make? Yeah, we've got a few folks commenting here. And misgendering, using wrong pronouns, I agree here. Making a comment about their looks, I agree there. Yeah, not using incorrect pronouns, absolutely. All right, so I think we've all identified the mistake. So what are some corrections here that might take place? How could we correct this behavior? What's the solution? Or a best practice based off that previous slide? So I'm just kind of trolling through some responses here. Yeah, Shauna says, why are you referring to anybody's appearance at all? Absolutely. Trudy with the best practice of, you can ask about identifying pronouns perhaps. Yeah, I think that's okay. I think a good way to ask that is perhaps saying your pronouns first as a model. And Christine here provides some good best practices as well. You want to accept identification that does not look like the person, and recognizing that it is challenging to update IDs as well. I agreed with everybody there. Good job, Christine. Yeah, and Benjamin, thank you for your replies here too. Great job, everybody. All right, in our next scenario, Jenny has just moved into a new apartment when she notices that her sink is leaking. She texts her new landlord about the repair and receives the following text message. Let's see what happens. Sure, I can make those repairs for you if you go out with me. So in this situation, let's think about this now a little differently. Okay, so we're going to change this up a little bit. I'm going to ask you this, see what we retained from our fair housing preview earlier on, our refresher. So what is the prohibited activity here? Yeah, good job, everybody. I see Rebecca, Stacy, Shauna. Yeah, in exchange for services. Yeah, this is an exchange for services. Sexual harassment. Hilda says sexual harassment and quid pro quo harassment. Absolutely. You're asking for something, as Kenise says. Good job, Beth. Yeah. You know what? I love this best practice. I just want to make a comment here that I love this best practice from Gerarda. And Gerarda says, no ifs. You know what? That is a great rule of thumb. Absolutely a great rule of thumb there, Gerarda. All right, I'm just making sure, seeing here, we got a lot of responses on that one. Remember, harassment is illegal under the Fair Housing Act. Sexual harassment is illegal. This is clearly an example of quid pro quo sexual harassment. The landlord is requiring, in this case, a date for repairs to be made. All right, in our next scenario, whoops. And hold on, I'm going to pause that there. Uh-oh, sorry. There we go. All right, in our next scenario, let me take a look here. Mark and John go to rent an apartment that is advertised on Craigslist. After agreeing to show them the unit, the landlord sees them holding hands as they approach the home with the rental sign. The landlord suddenly states, all right, so what do you think is the protected class present here? And what are some best practices? And then I have a follow-up question as well. So this could potentially be, yeah, this would be sexual orientation, I agree. Yeah, and Alexandra says, hey, the best practice is to rent to them. You don't want to misrepresent availability. I'd say this is misrepresenting availability because of somebody's protected class status, in this case, likely sexual orientation. Now, my follow-up question. Let's see if we can think about this, and some of you aren't allowed to answer this one, I'm kidding. But how could we uncover or prove that this is discriminatory? Yeah, and Richard brings up a good point here too. This could be race discrimination, absolutely. Yeah, and I said some of you weren't allowed to answer that one. No, kidding. Yeah, Christine says testing. So yeah, we would want to investigate this housing provider and use testing. And this is a great example of why testing is so important, because these folks could have been told exactly, oh, nothing's available right now because I just received an application, or because, yeah, I just received an application, or we just had any number of different things happen. It just came off the market. So yeah, we would need to test this property as a fair housing organization. And I like that Stacy went right there by saying, have another couple go in. Yeah, exactly. So we would have a matched pair couple go in, and we'd get to the bottom of this through testing. Good job on our scenarios, everybody. Let me just double check here our comment field. Yeah, great job, everybody. All right, so now we are going to, and I'm going to take a sip of water here. We are going to transition into our Q&A. So I am going to encourage you to submit now any questions. I'm going to focus on questions that are related to specifically discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, gender identity. But I would also encourage you, hey, you got me here. I don't mind answering questions about other topics, but I will focus on primarily some other, so the main focuses of today. So again, I'm going to encourage you to submit those questions. It's going to take me a second here. Let me review and figure out which ones we're going to be addressing. And Kristen and a few folks have asked about slide decks. I will pass that up the food chain, and if we are able to send out the decks, they will be sent out with that one pager. Again, you will all be receiving a one pager that was developed specifically for the content here today as well. But if I am able to, we will send out the all right. So let me double check some questions here. We have a question here. So let me see here. All right, let me go back up to the top because we had some people submit some questions later on or earlier on here. So we got a few questions that have generally fallen into this category of, well, how do I possibly verify somebody's ID if they look different than their ID? And I would strongly encourage you here to remember that it's important to accept these identifications, because remember, not many people have been able to update their IDs for a variety of different reasons. Also, remember that you don't want to be calling somebody out, in public like that, or publicly reinforcing in front of numerous people. I'd say be willing to accept alternative IDs. Remember that people are also, if they're giving you that ID, what are the situations again where people would be wanting to present, a quote unquote ID that's not them? So you want to be accepting identification that does not look like that person. Remember, it's a challenge to update IDs. Remember now also that many states do provide additional classifications or additional sexual orientations or gender identities usage or gender markers on an ID. And also be prepared. I mean, I'm sure most people are used to being asked a question as well, so they are probably ready to offer an explanation if you do need to continue asking a question. But I would, as a best practice, please always remember, if you for some reason are unable to accept that ID, yeah. But again, remember, you want to respect somebody's privacy as much as possible. You're not, and try to be flexible. I mean, as best as you can, remember those best practices that we shared today. What is the quickest, proper way to report discrimination, fair housing violations, or to request an investigation? I would say here, please remember, well, actually, we're going to have a slide on that. I will get to that question. I do see that one here. I'm going to answer that one in just a second. Let me see here. I have another, let's see, what are some other questions? Again, we have another question about what should that, I'm going to provide that information here in just a second, folks. We will be providing that information in just a second here. Let me just pull up any other questions here. We do have a question for what is best practice for gender-related questions on an application. Trying to think, could we get a more specific example of why you would ever be asking somebody's gender on an application? I think I need that to answer that question. However, just as a general best practice, I would always, you want to make that language as inclusive as possible. Absolutely. You're never making somebody select from two options, for example. But again, I don't know why. I'm trying to think off the top of my head why somebody would be offering or collecting that information, especially as it relates to housing. I see a lot of questions here. Here's a common one that's come up. What do I do if somebody comes into my office? What is the proper way to address them? And in general, again, I think you want to make sure that you are welcoming. I think you want to be inclusive. I think you want to remember gender neutral pronouns or a gender neutral greeting as well are going to be keys there. let me scroll here through some other questions. So I do have, and I'm happy that you all are submitting these questions. Let me see here. I do have a question about straight up, I will address this one again. So folks, under source of funds, vouchers, housing choice vouchers are now legal sources of income in Virginia. There are exemptions, so you may need to ask an attorney to see if you qualify. But again, language saying no Section 8, no vouchers allowed, generally going to be illegal. Again, you need to make sure the law applies to you because there are size exemptions, but generally speaking. I do want to reinforce, we've had a bunch of questions around IDs. Please remember that it can be incredibly challenging for somebody to change their ID. Also, please remember that you don't want to be outing somebody or questioning them in front of a number of different people. I encourage you to try and be accepting as possible. Now, I had a lot of people ask, what can I do? Who can I contact? And I love that question because I'm going to encourage you to contact the Equal Rights Center. You can always contact myself. Whoops, let me go back here. I'm going to send out my contact info or go to our website. Our website is probably the best place to go. Again, www.equalrightscenter.org. As you see there, you can always contact the Equal Rights Center. You see the Fairfax County Office of Human Rights and Equity Programs. They are listed up there as well. I'll send out their link. Please, if you have been discriminated against, if you feel like you are being discriminated against, or you want to report discrimination, again, you can always contact myself or contact the Equal Rights Center, or of course, contact Fairfax County as well. So I think I've hit most of the general questions here that have come up. You could also contact HUD or you could contact Virginia as well. Any other questions here? I think I've hit all the big themes on the questions. Well then, I guess we get about 15 minutes of our day back here today. All right, folks. Well, then it looks like there are no further questions. I don't think anything's coming up here. So, folks, we will be in touch. Glad people liked this scenario practice. Well, we will be in touch again. You will be receiving a one-pager with the updates, with the content. You will get that one-pager for sure here at your email. And again, if we can share the slide deck, certainly happy to always share slides, however they are. So, with that, again, hey, thank you all. I really appreciated all your time and conversation, all the comments and questions, and take care, everybody. Thank you. And the webinar will be concluding.